So we're going to start off by getting into a little bit of this commercialization. And to do that, we've got a business consultant, Rob Leishman, and Dr. Scott Goldsmith of Lancaster Fine Foods. And because these relationships are often fraught with disruption and contracts, we have our friend Jeremy Halpern of Nutter, McLennan and Fish to kind of walk us through the pain points that accompany going from kitchen to shelf. So guys, please come on up. So the way that we've kind of thought we'd do this is just to do some Q&A to try and generate some discussion. If there are questions at any point during this discussion, please raise your hand. I'll come right to you. We're going to go the full Phil Donahue style. And let's lay it out let's start off by just having you guys talk a little bit about who you are and what you do. Scott?
Well, good afternoon. My name is Scott Goldsmith, and I'm one of the partners and the Director of Business Development at Lancaster Fine Foods. And we are a small to mid-size specialty food co-packing operation in Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm Rob Leichman, and I'm the founder of the Lyric Group based here in New York. The Lyric Group essentially offers wraparound consultative services for growing emerging brands in the specialty food space.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeremy Halpern. I'm with a law firm called Nutter. We're based in Boston, and we have a client base all over the world and in the food business, certainly across the country, including some folks here, which I'm very happy to see. We spend most of our time helping people with 4 key areas, things on the corporate side and corporate finance, like fundraising, forming entities, tax decisions, employment, things like that. Commercial, we spend a lot of our time talking about co-packing, supply chain, distribution, brokerage, sales, marketing, whatever. A lot of stuff on the third front, IP, trademarks, patents, copyrights, and fourth on package review, labeling, recall, and fair advertising type issues. So, my partner Will is over there. He's the smart one. I'm just the pretty one.
High bar. So, guys, I've been making this great gravy in my kitchen, and I want to know when I'm ready to start thinking about going to a co-packer. What's going to tell me that I'm ready?
Great question. Well, obviously, passion, drive, and interest in moving forward. I mean, if somebody comes to me and says, look, I have the chocolate chip cookie of the lifetime. You know, everybody in my office, everybody at Thanksgiving dinner says, you should start a cookie company. The first thing we're going to talk about are cost of goods. We're going to talk about whether or not there's even white space on the shelf. You may have the greatest, gravy. It could be grandma's recipe. Does the world need another gravy? And you have to really start to vet that in your own head. Can it be made affordably? Do you have the funds to move forward? And just does the world need it? So I think the very first question you should ask yourself is there a white space? And is this going to end up being a $15 jar of gravy?
So I've come to you and you've said to me, well, there's some space here, but we can't make it in our kitchen. How am I going to get from you to Scott?
Right. So in that case, brands will often come to me and say exactly that. It's not so much that we're in a kitchen, but we're in a common space. We're in some sort of an incubator, like out in Brooklyn. We're at Brooklyn Food Works, and we're churning out product once a week and getting it to the farmers market. It's when you really want to play in the right sandbox and you want to know that the stuff is being produced consistently, that it's being produced in an environment where there is really safety, and you really want to be able to determine true costs. A lot of folks will come to me and say, well, you know, it's okay, don't worry about labor, I'm making it myself, as opposed to really factoring in, you know, everything that goes into cost of goods. And at that point, you start to think about migrating into a co-packer.
Okay, and Scott, when I come in, what are you looking for?
The story is very important, so trying to understand the passion and the story, how mature the process is. A lot of times people will call up and they'll make the mistake in saying everybody likes my barbecue sauce, and to me that's indicative of where they might be at in the process, and they may not be ready yet, but we're looking for capitalization, their ability to support the commercialization process.
But aren't you just machinery for hire?
I'm sorry?
Aren't you just machinery for hire?
Well, in some way, yes, but our lines, although we're not at full capacity at our facility, our human resources are quite limited. In the commercialization process requires a lot of resources, a lot of hand-holding, particularly with emerging brands, so I have to vet it in mind that does this particular project have the ability to last? Because if I'm going to, you know, if I have 3 or 4 people competing for those limited resources, I want to make sure that it's going to be the project that's going to last.
So what are the resource needs that have to be satisfied for a brand when it's working with you? There's line time.
Yeah, there's line time. In getting to the line takes a lot of time. It could be that, you know, there's a brand that we just fully commercialized this past week, and it's been a 1.5-year process.
So that's the innovation time as well.
Exactly, and more often than not, it's probably 7-8 months from the time of the original phone call and vetting to when they are ready with labels and when they have their scheduled processes and when the pricing is complete and they're ready for their first validation run.
And how often are brands switching from one manufacturer to another when they're coming to you? How do they stay afloat? Is it better to be quiet during that commercialization period?
I'm not sure I understood it. Can you repeat that one?
If I've been making stuff in a commercial kitchen, in a co-pack kitchen, and then I want to scale up a little bit, how do I ensure that my product is not completely dormant as it moves to your scale?
You want to answer that? Or?
Yeah, you know what? It's sort of a partial answer, but something that's, I think, very, very salient here, which is that a lot of younger brands don't really understand the enormity of the process, that everything is going to take longer than you think it will. Everything is more costly than you think it will. And oftentimes, it's the third co-packer that's the charm. So even if, you know, Scott's going through this process with the R&D, with the labeling, with all that good stuff, and just making sure that the formulation works for their machinery, that doesn't mean that they didn't already try it with 2 other co-packers. So those 7 months at Lancaster could be at the back end of 2 years with 2 other co-packers. There's a lot of trial and error, and your grandmother's sauce, which is super easy, you throw it into a kettle and it's done, is one thing. But say you're getting into the world of the sandwich cream cookie, like an Oreo. There's only like 4 or 5 manufacturers in the country that really do it, and they don't want to talk to you because they're looking to do a trailer load per SKU. Not affordable to you, and clearly not a wise investment of your time and resources. So I think to answer the question, you know, I think it's really important to be cognizant of how long the process actually takes.
There's also a bunch of hidden costs in there, right? When you go to a co-packer, most co-packers are going to require that you maintain some level of insurance coverage. So you've got insurance premiums. You may or may not want to engage a lawyer, although I often tell people for the first run, where you don't actually know whether this thing is valuable yet, doing it on just a straight PO basis and taking a lot of risk actually makes some economic sense. But when you move to the next level where you're going to want to lock in that supply for maybe a year, maybe 2 years or 3 years, you're going to have legal costs involved in that. You're going to have accounting costs. The product comes off the line and he's going to stick it on a dock and it needs to go somewhere, right? So do you have a warehouse? Is it going to, I know some brands that might be here where their apartment was their warehouse for a good portion of time, right? But that doesn't work if you have certain kinds of product. What if you have a refrigerated product, right? That's not going to work. So you have all these other things you need to have in play before you're ready to pull the trigger.
Is there a capacity checklist that brands should run through in terms of their co-packer, like the co-packer abilities and capacities?
I would say, yeah, that very, very important question. For us, capacity is not an issue. We happen to have a very large warehouse, and we have, as a co-packer, some value adds that other co-packers might not, in that we can retain inventory, and we can do fulfillment from our warehouse. As far as people outgrowing us, personally, the brands that we produce for, we're doing tractor trailer loads of product, but we're also doing minimum runs of a couple of pallets for, an initial stocking. So I think it's an important question for the brand owner to ask, but I don't think that they're going to, as a young or an emerging brand, find themselves in a situation, outside of a commercial kitchen, to where they're not going to be able to keep up with their need.
Sure.
I do think there are some things that, when I started in this business, people use terms all the time, and I just went like, nod, and then I went and looked stuff up. So I'm gonna help you out. Those co-pack relationships can mean a bunch of things. It can mean someone to whom you give a recipe to, and they turn a key, and other than your packaging material, they're sourcing everything, they're producing everything, and they're shipping it out on a trailer. It could also mean something else, which is that you're showing up with a lot of the materials. Well, that then means, to that question, you may not have a manufacturing capacity problem, but you may have a supply chain capacity problem. You can't get this special good that you've put in that is the heart of your brand. You've got to have that arrive. It's got to be sitting in the right place. It's got to go through quality control. You also have to think about work backwards from the delivery date and think, what are all my time frames? So they may not have a capacity problem, but they may have a timing problem. Can you agree that when you say, here's a purchase order, they're going to produce it within 2 weeks? Or is it going to be, here's a purchase order and we'll get to that when we're done with Nabisco, right? Or whoever it is that is their biggest customer. So you really have to think through some of the logistical pieces in addition to just, could they in theory service this business? They usually can. That's usually not the issue.
I meant, what other capabilities are you asking about aside from line time? You may need people who can operate a particular machine or who are familiar with working with a particular ingredient at a given time.
There's a number of questions to ask when you're vetting a co-packer. Aside from capacity, you might need something that's kosher or halal or any sort of dietary attribute. But what you really also want to know is, do they have the capability of doing R&D for you? As opposed to, I'm just going to hand over a formulation and let's see how it goes. Because remember, your product has to be adapted to their machinery. And even if, let's say you're doing a cookie at one co-packer, and you know exactly, it's a 14-minute cookie at 325 degrees in their rotary oven. You go to another co-packer and guess what? It's 16 minutes at 335 in their tunnel oven. So you have to go through the R&D process and know that they're willing and happy to work with you on that the charges aren't exorbitant to do the R&Ds, and that potentially or hopefully they'll actually kick back the R&D fee when you go full bore with them as a client. So I think that's part of it, the ability for them to knock out a nutrition panel. Sometimes, to do database analysis is often offered, but not all the time. You wanted to throw something?
That's, by the way, Jeff asked about before, traps for the unwary. This is the first moment, okay? When they say, we can do R&D for you, that's great. The question is, who owns the R&D?
Yeah, that's the question I was about
right?
to ask.
And so when you are validating that this is the partner you want to work with, you need to make sure that you have a written agreement that says all the proceeds of that R&D, that recipe, ideally even the processes involved in executing that are yours. Now, sometimes you have to split the recipe from the processes if they have very specialized equipment, and they're going to say, well, we do this thing for lots of customers, so you can't have that. But the recipe has to be yours. If you want, the fastest way to kill your company from growing to be a big company is don't own your IP.
Scott, is there a reason you guys would try and hang on to that IP?
That's not part of our philosophy. If a person's paying for their commercialization, they have rights to everything. And so I've heard from our customers that, hey, we tried to get our recipe and they wanted us to pay $7,500 to get their own recipe. And I've never fully understood that personally. And to me, if they came with a proprietary recipe and formulation, then that's theirs. And so
Have there been times when a transition from one company to another has been held up by that kind of situation?
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes they never get the recipe. Or, to be honest, there's times when they've been given a recipe that was intentionally wrong, where they'll give them a recipe that was not right because when we try to test it out, it was very clear that they.
Yeah, there's two possibilities of co-packers in the world. One is they're just a co-packer. Two is they're a co-packer who has their own brands. And if those brands are competitive with your brands, they start thinking really hard about who owns what IP, and how much they're going to help you, particularly if you're trying to walk away and then compete with them. So they are a great example of the way co-packers should work, but I work with an awful lot of co-packers who don't do it in a way that's going to lead to your success.
All right, so I'm sorry.
I'm actually working on this right now with,
Can you hold on one sec?
Hi. I'm actually working on this right now, taking an hors d'oeuvre type product from the kitchen, from the incubator, to a co-packer. The way it was explained to us for their NDA was that, yes, we have a recipe and we're going to bring it to them, we're going to work with it. By the time that product is finished, it's their recipe. And they're not going to, we have no right to it.
Work with someone else.
That's what I thought.
So let's say I'm bringing that formula in and they're going to work with it. How do I get it back?
So there are a couple things going on in that story, right? Usually what's happening is if they're expending resources, if I'm a co-packer and I've got an R&D team and I'm expending resources, I want to know that I'm not going to effectively give you that for free because you're just going to jump ship. And so sometimes the trade there is, okay, well, we're going to use you as our exclusive co-packer for at least some term, or at least some term in some geography, so that they can recoup that investment that they've made, which is fair, right? So when you go into it, you should have a conversation of, what value do you need to get from me? Is it cash up front? Is it some commitment over time? So that you get the benefit of the work you've done, right? You get value back for it, but I own the IP. And I just can't move forward if I don't own the IP.
Rob, we'll get you. There's a question that we came up, there was an issue that someone brought up, which was this notion of, am I capitalized enough? Because the question is, how much is it going to cost me to start working with a co-packer?
Right. So it really depends on your product and what your cost of goods are. You have something that costs $7 a unit versus $2 a unit, and you're doing 1,000 units. Do the math. For the brands that I work with, and actually I do a good amount of work with Lancaster Fine Foods and Scott. Let's say it's kettle-based business, whether it's pasta sauce or a vinaigrette or whatever. You have to start thinking in terms of $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 on those first production runs. That you're paying the co-packer ahead of time. It's very rare that they're going to give you any kind of terms whatsoever. You're paying them ahead of time, and you're not getting paid for that for months and months and months by the time the PO is paid for with the distributor. Plus, there's the R&D fees up front. So it could, suddenly you're looking at 50 grand on a first and second PO.
But guys, I don't have 50 grand. Scott, how are you going to work with me?
Well, we say, we're not going to be the bank, so there's going to have to be something that the brand owner comes prepared with. We're probably not going to get past that first step unless they understand that they're going to have to pay for that initial inventory, which is going to be, the validation run, which is your very first production run on the equipment on the line. It's a minimum sized run, so there's not that full exposure of a truckload of product. We want to execute what we did in the test kitchen on the line, and we want to minimize the exposure for not only us as the manufacturer, but also the brand owner, so you don't have 20 pallets of product that the brand owner's not comfortable with going out into the market. So I think that if a person comes to that initial conversation with an understanding that they're going to spend maybe $2,000 or $3,000 in R&D costs on maybe a line of 2 or 3 sauces, and then they're going to have that initial validation run of a minimum run of 250 gallons of each sauce, and then they have their labeling costs, and they're going to need to have, generally we'll allow the customer to make a 50% deposit on their first order, and then have them pay the remaining 50% before all the product leaves the facility. So $20,000 to $25,000 is actually a pretty accurate number for your standard startup.
And I just want to throw in one other thing. As a younger brand, part of it is you're pitching your product and your vision to the co-packer as well. Any co-packer who's really good and is going to have minimums in place. And you want to be able to come to the table and say, look, this is our pitch deck. These are our target retailers. We're actually connected with these folks by using brokers or our own internal resources on the sales side. But present yourself as a real business, not just as tire kickers, because they don't want to be tied up and wasting their own time going through the R&D process, whether they're paid for it or not. It's just taking up their time. It's not worth it.
So that leads you to the what do you do? Rich parents is good. If that doesn't work for you.
Yes.
The one obviously is angel investors. You get people to help cash flow the business for you. Those investors can also be bank debt. A lot of bank debt is put out by community banks who want to support local business, particularly if you're a women, minority, veteran, disabled-owned business. They get extra kind of brownie points for that. Number 2, sometimes the co-packers will in fact take terms, meaning they'll let you pay them after they have delivered the product. Very rarely the first time you're working with them. Number 3, everybody always asks me, will they take equity? We could have a whole hour on why that turns out to be more complicated than it sounds. And number 4, and the thing that people don't do enough is, if you go out and you grab one of the people who are great in the industry, if you go grab these guys or John or Bob back there, and they're on your advisory board and they have established relationships with a co-packer, that person becomes your credit. And all of a sudden the co-packer will say, oh, these guys don't work with fools, they don't work with not serious people, and yes, we might be able to extend terms. And so leveraging those relationships can be key.
Let's talk about other cost centers that are in the process. So you've got storage, you've got line time, you've got R&D, you've got ingredients. What else am I going to be looking at? What else am I on the hook for, guys?
Label development, and that's something that happens extraneous to, as a contract manufacturer, we never get involved with packaging development. That's a whole other ball of wax. We're focused pretty much on what's on the inside of the jar, the formulation, making sure that the integrity of the product and the safety.
But I got to make sure my jar is going to fit your machine, right?
Right. So we'll work together to determine what the best jar is, and there's a lot of discussion about packaging on the front end. But I think once the packaging has been determined as being able to run on our lines, I think that falls back on the packaging costs, then go into the development of the brand, the labeling, even the corrugated. Sometimes people go with custom corrugated.
2 additional things, not just what the material is of the packaging and its shape and size, but what's on that packaging and actually having somebody look and do a label review. You don't necessarily need a lawyer to, again, for a small first order, the answer is keep your marketing as simple and vanilla as possible so you don't need complex label review. Don't say this cures cancer, that's bad. Keep it simple. The second thing is, please, for the love of God, do your trademark work before you print your packaging. Because I hate when clients call me and say, can we get a trademark on this? And the answer is no, and you're violating somebody else's trademark. You need to rerun the packaging.
Another thing also, some folks overlook in the big equation is time and travel. I mentioned the sandwich cream example earlier. Well, I have a client who's sort of getting wedged into a co-packer that's an hour and a half outside of Chicago. He's based here in New York. It's pretty much the only co-packer who's a real fit for him domestically. That adds up. It's a lot of flights into O'Hare. It's a lot of it's a massive time suck back and forth. And you're going to be there on the first run, the second run, more than likely, and of course through the R&D process. So it becomes more than just a couple of $100. It becomes real money after a while.
So let's talk about that real money for a minute. Why wouldn't I just try and make it myself? Why wouldn't I want to go vertical? What's some of the calculus involved there that might cause me to say, well, I'm either going to build my own facility or I'm going to fund a piece of someone else's facility for my unique process? What are some of the considerations?
The consideration of should you do it usually comes down to you are not the A-plus player at manufacturing. They're the A-plus player at manufacturing. Go be what you can be the best in class at, which is the brand advocate, the marketer, the salesperson. Number two, if you think it's hard to raise $25,000, now go try and raise $1 million to build your own facility. That's however many times that is harder. Third, and this is, again, wearing the legal hat, you really don't want to hurt anybody. And so quality sounds fine when you can manage, you're creating enough for some farmers markets in your local area, but when you're going to run 10,000 units and you don't have the expertise to make sure that that product is safe, that's bad karma right there. So make sure you're thinking about that safety issue off the top.
Yeah, it just really takes your eye off the prize. You're in the business of building a brand, and once you start to get into the manufacturing world, it doesn't speak to your expertise, and it's all-consuming.
I suppose there's one exception, which is if you are doing something for which no co-packer is well situated to do it without extraordinary costs. For whatever reason, there's an ingredient that nobody's ever worked with before. A good example, we have a client who uses fruit fly-based protein. They had to build their own manufacturing facility, right? Because you can't just order that on the internet and have it show up and know how to process it.
I manufacture fruit flies on my kitchen counter.
This is a big industrial installation in northern Israel, right? I mean, it's a very big commitment of time and capital and resources. There are folks who are doing, again, you're doing like a novel shaped or size product where you go to them and they say, like, we could do it, but it's going to take $1 million of capital equipment to change out our line. Do you want to then have them do it or you do it? Now the calculus starts to shift, but for the vast majority of folks who are doing things more on the beaten path, it usually doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and it also begs the question at that point of, should I really be going into this particular business and this product? Is it worth it?
All right. So how do I be a good client, Scott?
I think understanding what manufacturers go through, being empathetic towards, managing the supply chain, procurement, the QC and the QA. There's a lot that goes into the manufacturing that a lot of brand owners don't understand. So the empathy is appreciated, and that collaborative spirit that we have, meaning, once we get by the R&D and we've advanced in the commercialization to where now we're at the validation run and we're actually producing on the lines, the sensitivity to the things that are out of our control, like when a truck doesn't show up with the correct ingredient. We, as a manufacturer, we like to do all the procurement if we can. And a lot of times our suppliers will send an ingredient that's out of spec or the wrong ingredient, and we're not in control of that. And to be hammered by a customer because that somebody else sent us the wrong ingredient. There needs to be an understanding, full understanding of what we go through in trying to execute on these orders. So I look for the right spirit and understanding rather than having a gotcha type of a relationship where there's always that, you owe me one now, those type of things, because manufacturing is very, very difficult. And if you're a brand owner and you're considering getting into it, I would say don't, because employees and in managing shipping and managing equipment breakdowns, and there's a lot of things that happen that makes co-packing very attractive, because those are distractions then for you as a brand owner, and you can't be out there doing what you do best, and that is telling your story and selling. So I think that's one of the biggest things, that understanding.
What should I expect you to be able to control?
Well, I think the specifications, the quality control. You come to me, I need to be making a product that's going to be food safe. It's something that's going to go out and not hurt anybody or make anybody sick. Products that are going to be the labeling, the label's going to be placed right, that you're going to have a clean jar, that you're not going to have a jar that had a fill and some jelly got onto the label, and my team allowed that to go down and get packed into a box. So one of the value adds that I would say for our company is that it's in Lancaster County, and Lancaster County is known for its integrity and wholesomeness and goodness, and a lot of the people who work for us care at the end of the day about the job that they've done, so that the product is getting the same care that you would give if you were packing it yourself. So
you can ask your co-packer for actually quite a lot as you start to work with them, and they're usually okay with that if they understand that they're investing into you as a brand, right? So things that sometimes people don't remember to ask for. If they're willing to store product for you, if they've got the room in their facility to store cost-free for 30, even 14 days, that can make a huge difference to your business, right? If they have the ability to get you volume pricing, and they're spreading, if they're buying an ingredient across all their customers and you're getting the benefit of that, that is a huge opportunity. You should expect them not just to meet their quality specs, but a whole host of things like certifications, like allergen-free. And that includes being responsible for their selection and the delivery of quality goods from the ingredient manufacturers. Some of you may have read, this was going back to January, there was one little tiny ingredient supplier, I think in upstate New York, who had a recall issue. It wasn't even in the product, it was found in the plant. And that meant all of the people they gave ingredients to and all of the people they gave ingredients to had recalls. And so in 2 weeks, there were, 65 recall notices. All the companies had to pull that back. Well, if you're the brand, you're out of business. If you have to pay those costs of recall, you are out of business. And by the way, your product liability insurance doesn't cover any of those costs. Zero, nothing, bupkis, right? So if the co-packer is behind you and says, yep, I understand that's my responsibility for the quality of the item, you are in a much better place. So important things to keep an eye on.
Right, I think another thing also is knowing that you could audit pricing on commodity items specifically. So say butter is at $2.35 a pound and it plummets to $1.95. You want to know that you are going to benefit from that. The flip side of it is if butter goes through the roof and goes to $2.75, they're going to come back to you and say, hey, we have to massage the price a bit. But really, really make sure that you're on top of the prices.
All right. What are some other spots on the margin where I'm potentially going to end up in dispute with my co-packer, and what's the best way to handle this?
Since I'm the dispute human, very, very important things for you guys. Any form of exclusivity that's an obligation to you. You are not allowed to work with another co-packer either at all or within a certain geography or for a certain set of products. The stuff that you get handed by many of the co-packers says, we're your exclusive provider for anything you do nationwide, and this contract is a 3-year deal. Well, that's a huge problem for you. If you start and your co-packer is on the West Coast and you have a heavy good and you open a market in the East Coast, you're now agreeing to pay 3,000 miles of shipping. right, for every good for the next 3 years. That's a huge problem. So you want to look at geography, you want to look at exclusivity, you want to limit the deal you're cutting with this co-packer to this set of products, not any product you might ever do, right? Those are huge. You also want to have the ability to hold them accountable for their quality, for their delivery of the services you've contracted for. And if they're not, that you have the ability to get out of that deal and without having to pay penalties or fees or other kinds of things, because that's the only stick you've got in that relationship. And you hope it's not a stick thing. You hope it's a collaborative, really great relationship, but it doesn't always go that way. And you need to have that ability to get out.
Do you have any reason that you wouldn't offer exclusivities? Or
Well, some of the things that are being mentioned that other co-packers do, we don't do. We don't do those type of restrictions. I have a couple of customers that we have very long contractual agreements, but generally speaking, when somebody comes to us and we don't lay that on them, that burden.
Rob, are those the kinds of things that you've found are negotiable with co-packers?
Wow, it really depends on the co-packer. I like to think of Scott as a unicorn to a degree in the landscape of co-packers. Most folks have pretty buttoned up contracts that they want you to go through, and they're very much, I would say, in favor of the co-packer, for sure.
So on that score, sometimes you can get exclusivity from them. They may agree if they're not in the business of packing your particular product for lots of people already. They're starting into this kind of business, that they'll not pack for themselves, they won't have a house brand, and they won't pack for anybody else who has a substantially similar product. So that can be a really important piece of the puzzle. The pricing and the way, whether it's variable or it's toll, is at cost plus. Those are negotiable. The minimums, the run size is very critical for you as a small brand to manage inventory. So if you can work with them to say, like, I get this is a huge pain in the ass, but can you please help me get it down from your 25,000 units to 15,000 units for the first one, so we can actually validate whether we have what we have. Those can be really big wins for you.
Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, you're looking for a happy marriage. This is a lot of money, it's a lot of effort, it's your baby that you're trying to put out there. And, we've spoken about, to a degree, transparency in terms of costs and obviously consistency. The product has to look great every single time, taste great every single time. But communication is paramount. And you have to know that you're working with people that you really like and get you and understand where you're going and your vision. And you have to be able to have a very good line of communication, not just with the powers that be at the co-pack level, but also the person who's on the line making your product. Can you reach them? Will they come back to you with an email or a call within a day or so, or a reasonable amount of time? Because that's the person, that QA, that QC person, that's the person who's really touching your product. So it's not just, wow, I can't get the co-packer owner on the phone. You really need to know that throughout the chain, you're having a good level of communication.
And let me offer you one other thing, which is sometimes because of the way you guys get started, it gets confusing the way this turns over. When you start, you go to them and you have this one PO and you're like, please make this for me. And what you need is actually something different. You need the ability to make them make it for you, which sounds weird, right? But you want a contract that says, if I show up with a PO, you are required to manufacture. Because in the absence of that, when investors look at you, when an acquirer looks at you, they say, you don't have a stable supply chain. If he can just say no when you show up, that's a huge problem, right? It doesn't create enough predictability and consistency. And so if you don't have those things in place, if you get investment, your valuation will typically go down because, again, you're more risky without those things in play.
Well, how do I ensure that, though?
So that is the conversation, and most co-packers are okay with the idea that they're signing up for a term of service. What you don't want is them to take it all the way to the other side, which is, okay, and now it's perpetual unless you pay me some whopping fee, right? So you want to have, in an ideal world, you have like a one-year contract that at your option you can roll over for successive one-year terms. That's the gold standard. That's hard to get early on unless you have a pretty transformative brand that they're very excited about.
So do we have questions out here? Sir?
Hi don't know, Scott, do you advise people who come to you with a new brand on their P&L, the margins they're getting, the pricing they're looking for? I mean, if you see something that is obviously way underpriced or has no margins, you say, we're not going to touch it because you'll die in the short period of time?
Generally, we don't get in those type of conversations. We're strictly a manufacturer, and getting in any type of consulting. Most people, when we kind of go through the pricing model with them, it becomes very, very apparent to everybody, what needs to be done. I have people who I work with who have experience in the branding world, who have come from that world, and a lot of times I can engage them if I see that there's a necessity. But those type of conversations are pretty rare, and most people, when they come to us, we vetted the brand and the project fairly well, and most of our emerging brands are quite astute, and they're sharp people who are coming from a business background, and they're pretty well targeted already.
Other questions?
Hi. What if you have a product that requires a little bit more art than just science? If you're working with fresh products, say, I'm just making this up, like a jam, and the strawberries, for one run are sweeter than the next one, there has to be a little give and take in terms of the recipe. So are co-packers sort of lined up to do that? Are they equipped to make those calls on the ultimate product?
Yeah, most of the products that we work with are natural, and with that, they're coming to us the way way they were created. We had an issue last year that comes to mind with blueberries, and we were getting blueberries coming in from a different region of the country, and as a result, there was a different pH, and that pH then affected the set of the jam. And we went ahead with, and this can lead to a couple of different conversations, but we had made 2 batches, and the batches were failing. They were not setting, and we couldn't figure out what was going on, and we were doing nothing wrong. And as we began to discuss it further and evaluate the ingredients, we saw that they were coming from a different region, and then we found out that there was a different spec on them, and then ultimately those losses were then shared with the brand owner. The brand owner realized that we did everything according to the spec and to the process, and we worked through it. So we will encounter variations, particularly with natural products, and we do the best that we can in the R&D to mitigate that, to discuss it, to manage that expectation. Peppers will come in with different water contents, and oftentimes cook times then become affected when you're trying to achieve a targeted Brix. So it may take an hour and a half to make a harissa one time, and then the next time it takes 2 hours and 45 minutes. And that's not something as the manufacturer you want to absorb as a loss. So those things then come to, those are things you can't necessarily define in a contract. So the spirit of the working relationship then has an opportunity to be then exhibited, and it's not always going back to the brand owner is where they have to necessarily absorb that loss. There are times where it's converse, and then we as the manufacturer have to absorb a loss.
But that's one of the things that a knowledgeable co-packer will be able to lay out for the brand owner as they come in, correct? Like, I'm familiar enough with this ingredient to say, we might have some variation here. This is how we address it.
Literally last week, we have a client whose product has to meet a color spec at the end, right? Which is no easy thing when you're doing natural products. And so, again, there's no great way to define it unless we wanted to do spectroscopy on every thing that came through, which they're not set up to do. And so the agreement was, it's a visual inspection with like some Pantones, and that we all agree it's close enough. And there's going to be times it's not going to be close enough, and we'll have to figure out how that works. But yeah, If they don't raise those issues, that's a flag.
I was thinking more about the tools. Do you have people skilled to say, this is what I'm saying?
Yeah. And that's where it becomes tough. I mean, sensory is a part of the QA. You know, we want everything that we make, we want it to be tasted. The problem is your controls sometimes are aged. And it's hard to, because of oxidation, you don't have something that is a standard. And you know, the people that we have, and speaking to the art of it, we do have people around who then have the artistry. And if it's an issue, a lot of times it's simply just reaching out to, I tell my customers, you get good news fast and you get bad news faster. So it could be that we just overnight a sample, get that customer's input to see if they're comfortable with that going out or if we need to do something else.
All right. So I'm afraid we're out of time. Other questions can be directed to these guys during breaks and during our table captain period. But now we're going to reset the podium. And guys, thank you so much. That was terrific.